Welcome into Priced Out the Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Morgan, alongside Cornelius Swart. How you doing today, man?
I don't get the lovely Cornelia Swart.
Yeah, no. Sometimes it's just no.
Yeah, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night.
You didn't. Yeah. Well, that's what happens, I guess, when you're lovely. You're always on high demand. So we've got a
It's
real.
awkward.
Yeah, let's move past it. So, what do we got for him today?
Oh, today we have an expansive, epic conversation about Detroit with Louis Aguilar, who's a development and real estate reporter for the Detroit News. And we're going to talk about the collapse of democracy and capitalism. How's that for a nice hyperbolic intro? Detroit is a place where there is a section of the city that's being revitalized, where there's new investment, tons of new investment going on, and it's being done by essentially four entities: two billionaires, one government agency, and one sort of private nonprofit. And so the traditional capitalism model of lots of different businesses and ventures and things going on and competing and creating the best man wins really doesn't operate in Detroit. So it's a fascinating conversation. There's lots of details, and we're just going to jump right in.
All right.
All right, today I have Louis Aguilar, who is a reporter for the Detroit News. He's been there for 14 years. He covers real estate and development. We're really, really honored to have him. I know that he's a busy guy, as all Daily Newsroom folks are, and he is an expert on what's going on in Detroit. So Detroit, for me, represents like a failed state in America. It's a place where liberalism has failed, and I mean that by both capitalism and democracy essentially ceased to operate within the bounds of Detroit for decades, and democracy more or less in operation for most of it. But there were periods in which there was no local election that really mattered. It seemed it's just the worst case scenario for the American city, and the decline that we've documented in Priced Out and talked about in other cities, where there's a decline of industry, white flight. The riots of 1967 left the area devastated. But before that, there was a major environment of segregation in Detroit. In 1941, black neighborhoods were literally walled off. A literal wall was built. It's still there along 8 Mile that cut them off from the new white suburban developments. The discrimination, housing discriminations, redlining, urban renewal that we've seen in other places were really the worst case scenario in Detroit. And so after decades of losing population, the housing crisis hit Detroit perhaps harder than any place in the country. In 2007, a third of the city's homes went into foreclosure. There was a time period in which there were 30,000 evictions happening in the city per year, and that put homes into the hands of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, who sold off the properties in bulk, often to predatory lenders, or just let the things go into tax foreclosure. So in 2013, this led to the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. And in 2013, there were up to 40,000 deserted homes in the city. And since then, the city has been turning around. It was a decade in the making, but there's been really no one I can think of who's been documenting that change more than Louis. Louis, thanks so much for coming on.
That's quite a scenario. I'm very proud to be a native Detroiter. I knew we were unique in so many ways. Yeah, no, that's a lot to unpack, but I mean, it's interesting when you were talking about the broader statements you initially made about failure of democracy and capitalism. It's interesting what went through my head when you said that is that how people from different sides of the political spectrum use that to their own advantage and their own spin of why and who is responsible and what are the causes for it. I mean, I think both sides at certain points obviously use that argument, but I clearly, I mean, they point to different reasons why it happened.
And to me, it's less about blame because we're like talking about this
Sure,
from
yeah,
so high up, that like we're at the 40,000 foot level here.
sure.
But I think it's important for people to know that basically the state and the federal government basically kind of seized control of Detroit during the Obama administration. Um, I mean, there was federal auditors, right? Sort of
Sure, yeah.
taking
And we
over.
just we finally just about a year ago, the city no longer had to answer to a federal overseeing budget control of in terms of their budget for I don't know how long, how many years the police department were under sort of federal oversight because of the corruption, other cases of abuse, and so they were under federal oversight for a number of years as well.
Yeah, and I think in terms of blame, I almost say that sort of capitalism failed first and democracy failed second. That's the only blame I would put on the system. I wouldn't point fingers.
I would recommend if people are interested in Detroit. I think the book that most people point to uh, as sort of the big picture of what happened to Detroit is I believe he's now a Princeton professor. His name is Thomas Segru, and it's simply called Detroit: Origins of an Urban Crisis, which
Mm.
kind of takes a look at the root causes of all of this. And not to sound socialist or anything, but I mean, really, he kind of lays out the fact that the roots of our failures really were well instilled when we were big, when we were the head of the middle class, when we had tons of manufacturing jobs, but there were also deep segregationist policies at that time that just when the manufacturing jobs in a way, the segregation policies still were there. So that's often been a book that many people point to as a pretty good objective view of what happened to Detroit.
Mhm. So in the last decade or so, the city has been making a comeback, and it's an epic comeback that a lot of people are aware of. Just some quick numbers: police response times have been cut from 50 minutes to get a police to respond, if they do respond at all. In 2013, it took 50 minutes for police to respond to a call to 14 minutes, 14 and a half minutes in 2017. Ambulance response times fell from 20 minutes in 2014 to the national average of 8 minutes. And after a peak of 28% unemployment in 2009, the city's unemployment rate has been cut to 8%. So, I mean, there's a lot of those houses have come back in line, those houses that were in foreclosure. There's been a tremendous amount of building in what you call the bubble, and that's really kind of the focus of this conversation is what's going on
Sure.
in the bubble. What is the bubble?
The bubble is 7.2 square miles of what real estate developers now refer to as greater downtown Detroit. It's essentially downtown parts of the riverfront by downtown toward the main artery Woodward that goes up to cover the place where the Detroit Institute of Arts is at, and Wayne State, and other cultural institutions. And so it's literally 7.2 square miles where I would say a vast majority of the investment has gone in the past decade in terms of private investment, but also public investment. So it's operating at a way different speed in terms of a rebound. There are people moving there as the rest of Detroit continues to lose population. It is controlled by heavy investment from two billionaire families in particular. So it's 7.2 square miles of the greater, I think Detroit is 139 square miles of Detroit. And
Hmm.
so there are other parts of the city that are getting investment, but nothing like greater downtown,
Can you give us a
as it's
sense of the
called.
scale of that investment?
I'm gonna say probably 10 billion in the past decade
Hmm.
so far. There's two main billionaires that have invested at least, I'd say, 3 billion apiece. One is the founder of Quicken Loans, Dan Gilbert, who also owns the Cleveland Cavaliers, and in 2010 he literally moved his Quicken Loans headquarters to downtown, and since then he went on what he called a skyscraper sale, and he's bought more than 90 downtown properties, and so
And those are whole
he's
skyscrapers. When you say 90 downtown properties, you don't mean like a corner bodega and like, an abandoned
yeah
hardware
no,
store. You mean like a 40-story apartment, office
yeah
building.
the major architectural pieces of Detroit. He owns. It's not all skyscrapers, but a lot of it is buildings and smaller buildings on the main core of Woodward. He
Were
owns
they
lots of
involved with
parking
subprime
garages.
lending? Did they do any of that? Quicken Loans?
Yeah, yes, but how much they were involved is quite a matter of dispute between his perspective and other perspective. They weren't the leading subprime lenders in Detroit or other places. I think anyone who was involved in mortgages during that period had to get involved in some way.
Hmm.
So they were involved. I'm not even going to try to get into percentages or things like that, or
Sure.
how much they were involved, because they disputed bitterly that they uh, I, a whole host of reasons of why, but they were involved. How much they were involved is a matter of dispute.
Right. So some of your foreclosure dollars at work there in uh,
Yeah.
downtown
Yes.
redevelopment now.
Yeah. I will say, despite you know, Quicken Loans is the largest online mortgage bank or mortgage lender in the
Hmm.
United States. But still, to give a sense of how Detroit's housing market is still dysfunctional, there are less than 500 traditional mortgages granted in the city for the past
Wow.
few years. Even now, yeah, and most of it, I would venture, is in that uh, greater downtown.
Right. Wow. And so to kind of back up again and just again, I don't usually get ideological on these podcasts. It's just a theme
Sure.
that I'm throwing over this one because the scope and scale of this conversation is so enormous. Um, but the again, the idea of like capitalism being a bunch of people competing to produce highest and best value, or to produce the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people, a lot of small owners competing, or small inventors, is not really an operation in this bubble. It's really more of a fiefdom. It's more of like just giant institutions and giant players who are almost non-competitive, and who are just kind of work. There's just these four giant entities in operation, and those are these two billionaires, Gilbert and Illitch, and then two kind of semi public entities. But let's talk um, a little bit more about Gilbert and how he's transformed downtown. He's also moved a lot of employees down there, right?
Yeah, he's moved a lot of employees. There are, I don't know, somehow companies connected to him that either they're like contractors for him, or maybe he's just an investor. But I think the latest number was 15,000 new workers have come to downtown Detroit
Wow.
since he moved in 2010. But I literally went out and counted how many empty buildings were in downtown proper, the area that he concentrates on. And I counted 48 big empty buildings,
Wow.
and big meaning uh, at least 10,000 square feet, a building that would have taken financing, traditional lending for investment to come back. And now I would say there's less than 10 uh, big empty buildings. I mean, it is truly uh, night and day. I mean, there are just so many new restaurants, and I think last year I counted there were 100 new restaurants and retail shops mainly within uh, greater downtown.
And Gilbert gives like
So
breaks for his tenants, for like his employees if they rent um, space in his apartments, or gives them free rent for a little
he
while.
doesn't have much. He doesn't have much housing downtown. Uh, I don't know if he gives breaks to people who some of his workers don't. I don't think he does.
He
He
said something.
encourages it,
In the last
but
days of Chinatown, this is kind of a link to a film that we talked about
oh
um,
sure, yeah,
in a previous podcast. I believe he said something like he was at full occupancy in these buildings.
yeah. He was talking. They were talking about downtown in general.
Mm.
Um, I mean, granted, there wasn't a lot of housing downtown. What he did, the way he found new uses for many of these historical skyscrapers and other historical buildings, that I mean, they were office spaces, and they were outdated as office spaces. Basically, they were too small. The parking was a situation that people didn't want to deal with. But he converted a lot of that into housing or
Hmm.
other uses, and so that's one of the ways he found it uses for his buildings. Um, but in terms of does he offer them incentives to move there? I don't know. There are other incentive programs in greater downtown, other parts of downtown. I don't know if he offers specifically incentives.
And he's also set up some security cameras in the city streets. Uh,
Oh yeah, yeah. He has a big war room kind of thing, just full of monitors. I don't know how many security cameras he's put up, but mainly if he's bought a building, he's got his security camera on it. It feeds to this large, control room, and the information he shares with Detroit police. He So he's got lots of monitors of streets and the big public park called Campus Martius. So yeah, it's there's a lot of security cameras downtown that didn't exist before.
and that's basically to track and make sure his employees are safe and that his investments
Well,
are secure.
and also I mean, generally, generally most people are supportive of it, although there's clearly a vocal minority against it. But generally, especially a lot of business leaders were for it because they were aware of the perception that most people didn't want to come downtown Detroit because of the
Hmm.
crime. And so they touted it as another safety measure that, things will be recorded. I mean, your safety will be there. I mean, we have an eye on things in public streets and things like that. So there is obviously a vocal minority, as one could probably expect, of having public spaces monitored and having that information shared with the police. But generally, overall, I don't see a whole lot of resistance.
Mm.
And let me ask that question. I mean, you were talking about these. Let me ask that question. I mean, you were talking about these fiefdoms, and I do want to ask you about that. I mean, how are you aware of other American cities that are big chunks of it are controlled by one entity, essentially, where they have gone in and bought, you know, seemingly the majority of the developments, and now really call the shots.
Yeah, I am not aware of that. That's kind of what you know I wanted to talk about. It seems so unique. I've never seen a city where there was kind of like a fire sale that went on. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
and this
Yeah,
this thing I talked about earlier was just Fannie Mae and Bank of America basically just
sure.
selling off houses in bulk um, to a lot of people who are exploiting the market and the regulations. I've never, I don't know of any other city where that's going on or where it could. Um, I don't even, I mean, Newark is such a small city and had a lot of abandonment, but yeah, I mean, and we've talked about St. Louis, and there's a lot of abandonment there, but I haven't heard of any huge players coming in. Now, one of the reasons why I might not be aware of it is something that you've reported out, which is the Illitch family and their development in Midtown, what used to be known as the Cass Corridor, where they were kind of secretly buying up things. And certainly
Sure.
that happens where people use a shell company or a lot of shell companies to acquire, to assemble land. What has Illich been doing over there?
So yeah, the other billionaire that controls a big swath of greater downtown is called the Ilitch family. The Ilitch family, the parents, Marion and Mike, are the co-founders of Little Caesars Pizza. Starting, I think, in the '80s, they moved their headquarters from the suburbs to downtown. Mike went on to buy the Detroit Tigers and the Detroit Red Wings. Marion went on to own the Motor City Casino, and they, for the past 15 years or so, starting about 15 years ago, they secretly started to buy up properties in one of the most desolate, poorest parts of Detroit. It's called Cass Corridor, just north of downtown. And they, in coordination with the city, they really just bought 22 properties in a 4 block area to secure the space for their new Little Caesars Arena.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, they probably spent about $50 million just for that 4 block area of properties. And they've spent several million more in a 50 block area surrounding that arena for them to develop what's called the District Detroit, which they unveiled, I don't know, 4 years ago, as saying not only are we going to build a new arena, we're going to transform this part of Detroit called District Detroit. And it's going to be full of new residents and retail and, offices, and it's going to be great. And what was interesting is that, of course, I started to track their mystery purchases about 2 years before they unveiled it, and they simply would just deny that. They wouldn't really comment on what was going on, nor would the city. But I mean, in this really poor part of town, they were buying literally like flop houses, cab stations for a couple $1 million, and it wasn't that hard to figure out that something big was planned there. But
And
no one knew about.
how much
No one
did that
knew
affect?
how.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But no one knew the extent of how much they were buying and how big of an area they were buying. And then when it got unveiled, I mean, it got unveiled of, look, hey, we are going to offer this big thing with, a new arena, 50 blocks. We just need, $324 million in public tax support. So when it gets unveiled, it gets unveiled as this huge, great plan with great jobs, and we're going to transform 50 blocks of Detroit.
And it was like a done
I mean,
deal,
it's
right?
hard.
It's like that. It had like
Yeah, I
some
mean,
approval already from the city.
yeah, it had approval from the legislature
Mm.
to approve the tax breaks, promise of jobs and reviving a big swath of Detroit. I mean, that is something so hard to combat. And so, the people who had any qualms against it were always kind of on their heels of like trying to gather information of what just happened, and also then to just have the unenviable position, the bad position of saying you are against jobs or something, or revitalizing Detroit. And obviously, that didn't go very far, and that thing passed uh, without much of a hitch.
I've seen, many times where you have a commercial district that gentrifies, it does turn out that there's a single landlord who is the dominant
Uh,
property owner. Earliest example here in Portland would be a guy named Singer who owns most of Northwest 23rd or did at one time, pushing for revitalization. And he's almost like the anchor developer, the anchor landlord, like you would have in a mall, right? A mall would have,
Sure. Yeah.
I guess, a Macy's or a Sears back in the day, and then all the little
Sure.
guys would cluster around them, and so that's typical. But to do it at such a
Uh,
scale as Illich and Gilbert are doing is I've never heard of anything like that. But the thing I want to talk about with Illich, and maybe this is another podcast, which is just about how do you make money from abandonment? How do you make money from poverty in landlording and urban development? Is that, do you feel like the secret ownership of all these properties, while Illich was accumulating this block of 50 blocks, was that driving prices down? Was that part of the
oh,
design of the endeavor?
sure. Yeah. No, I literally, when they unveiled the project, that was the question I asked Chris Illitch, who's now, he's the son of Mike, who passed away, and Marion, who's still around. But he's the heir apparent, and he's the guy who runs things now. So I asked him, you have a bad reputation, really, of holding on to historic buildings and not doing anything with them. And he said it was painful, but it was true that that they had to keep buildings empty for years because they didn't want to start a price war. So
They didn't want people to
that,
know that they're acquiring
yeah,
land and therefore hold out for more money.
correct. And so they said it was painful for them to hold on to property and not do anything with it, but in order for them to accumulate all the land they needed for the big plan, that's what they had to do.
And this is what's so
So
beautifully illustrated in the movie The Last Days of Chinatown. The filmmaker
sure.
sort of wandering around like a ghost in this abandoned landscape, kind of asking the sky why it has to be this way, and then you find out that it is that way completely by design, because Illich is buying up this land and doesn't want development, doesn't want buildings to be fixed up, doesn't want other owners to come in, wants to see nothing happen there, and that got his way.
I would say, as unbiased as I can be, is that really the verdict of what the Illiches are trying to achieve has still not come to pass. It, if in fact they turn around 50 blocks of Detroit, I think most people would consider it a victory.
Hmm.
It's too soon to tell. I mean, the arena opened less than a year ago. They have done some development, probably more than 200 million more development beyond the arena. Uh, there's a new school of business by Wayne State right next to their arena. There's going to be a new sports medicine facility by one of the local hospitals. Uh, they are building a new corporate headquarters for Little Caesars headquarters. Uh, but it takes up so little territory of that 50 blocks. And if they can't find a way to develop the 50 blocks, then it will have been not what they said it was going to be.
Mm.
But it's, in theory, they have part of the development agreement, which you gave them, the ability to have the tax breaks. They have 5 years to fulfill their promise, and so it's less than 1 year. But I mean, there's been many times when they first announced it, they said all this stuff will be online when the arena opens, and that is not the case.
Mm.
There's been a couple projects they've already repackaged to, it was going to be residential, and now it's going to be office. There's still many prolonged fights with historic preservationists over certain buildings that they want to knock down, and historic preservationists don't want to see knocked down. So it's still a promise unfulfilled. The thing I wanted to ask you, and maybe you were going to get into it later, is the gentrification issue in Detroit. I mean, certainly a lot of people bring up the issue, but in fact, Cass Corridor, there have not been a lot of people displaced. I mean, a lot of it was empty, even before Illich started to buy things up, and you can say he halted any chance of it having some sort of organic growth. But in fact, there was lots of people who had already left. In downtown Detroit, there weren't a whole lot of people living there, and so if gentrification is the definition of people literally being priced out, while it certainly happened in Detroit, there just haven't been a lot of people who have been relocated. And I wonder if that's unique to Detroit because we were certainly lost so much of our population, or I mean,
I, th-
do you see that in other places?
I think it is. I think there's some, this the scale of what's going on in Detroit is just so, off the charts that it's hard to compare it to other places. But the overall cycle, I think, is the same. In the early days of gentrification, well, before gentrification actually happens, there's this revitalization period that often happens, and usually
Mm.
places are abandoned. There's, we now Albina, where we are right now, which is the historically black part of Portland. There was about 10% of all the buildings were abandoned in the 1990s when white residents first started coming in. And so really that first wave of growth was just people filling in where there was nothing before, or at least
Okay.
recently. And everybody was just sort of, applauding. It was a period in which
Uh,
many residents welcomed the newcomers, the new investment. And
okay.
so there does get to be a point where all the vacant land, at least here in this neighborhood, was filled in, and then people who already had homes were getting pushed out to make
Uh,
way for new folks who could pay more. And then, of course, people buy up houses and knock them down to build higher rise houses, and
sure.
and the cycle goes on. So it's almost like it always happens this way, where there's this cycle where everyone's like, oh great, bring it on. We can't, we don't have
Sure.
gentrification, we can't get enough new investment, but it quickly
Okay.
goes the other direction.
And so in Portland, when you say the many people who got relocated, did they own their properties and was simply property tax too high, or they did not own their properties, or
Yeah,
a
so
mix of the?
gentrification is sort of the latest chapter in a long book of housing discrimination. So it's hard to just sort of pluck that one chapter out of the book. So it comes after redlining, it comes after, codes, compacts, and restrictions where
Mm,
developers won't sell properties to minorities. So in Albina, for example, the home ownership rate was about 50 to 40% or 30% now amongst minorities, compared to 65, 70% white home ownership. So what
mm,
I'm saying is that it was a disproportionately high amount of renters in
sure.
the
Okay.
neighborhood once people started reinvesting. And I think Detroit is pretty much the same. I think I read that Detroit had like the highest amount of renters of
Sure.
any city in America. And so
Yes.
again, capitalism kind of fails when there's not a lot of when there isn't a diversity of ownership, right? If it's only four guys owning all the property and renting it out to the other, 99,000, it's really not capitalism. So what happened here was that people didn't own their properties, so as rising land values, as land prices went up, they did not benefit. It only benefits if you own a piece of land to the gentrification cycle.
Sure. Yeah. I
What?
was thinking about the first time I think I wrote about a gentrification issue is what I was. This was boy. This was. I think this was 2000, and when I was in Washington D.C. and I was an editor for a while for this small Latino press, and I wrote a story about Santa Fe, New Mexico, and how Santa Fe, New Mexico, for the first time in its history, was majority white
Oh wow.
because of the property taxes. It wasn't renters; it was just the Latino families, like who had been there for generations. They had the property values of that small town where literally millionaires came in and
Mm-hmm.
bought stuff that they had. changed the racial makeup of the town, where it was no longer majority Latino
Hmm.
because so many families had to leave simply because of the property taxes, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and you have a big property tax issue there. It's like every city's a little bit different. We don't have property tax issues so much here because we're on the West Coast and everybody, California, Washington, and
Mm,
Oregon, all froze and
sure.
capped their property taxes. So our issues of displacement are really just around. It can be property taxes, but it's more around rent. It's more around cost of living, as opposed to people getting their taxes raised on them and they're on a fixed income, say. But that does lead to sort of my other question, which is maybe we'll jump into the other big landlords in a second, but so you're not hearing a lot of people saying, "Oh, we're concerned about this new investment," or are there people who are beginning to say,
Oh,
this might go south for us over the long run?
yeah, there is a rising chorus of people concerned about raising rents, gentrification. Yeah, there's certainly that streak now in Detroit. Not enough to change much, to be honest. I mean, development deals with tax breaks still get approved and heralded as great things to happen in Detroit because we need the investment. There is something called Detroit City Council now has something called a community benefits agreement, in which if a development, I think over $70 million or something, uh, has to agree to a community benefits pact, which basically is a committee that they formed with people in that community to sort of monitor the situation in terms of what the development's going to be, of how many jobs go to city residents, what how much affordable housing there's going to be in the project. There's another ordinance about 20% of a new development that gets tax
Hmm.
breaks has to be affordable housing.
What
So
MFI, median family income qualifies as affordable housing in that law? Do you know?
well, that's interesting because it's the Metro Detroit MFI, and I think
Right.
it's about 38,000 or something.
Hmm.
I could be wrong, and which is not what most people in Detroit.
Right.
So I mean, it doesn't do a lot of good for many people in Detroit because they use the region-wide standard,
Right.
which is different from Detroit, which is much lower. So that's an issue.
So people are beginning to
So
get concerned, and there are some legislative moves that are. But you're saying it's kind of it's 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 small scale.
yeah, it's little pieces of things, and there was another local ordinance regarding the number of contractors you need to hire. You're supposed to hire at least 51% Detroit residents
Mm.
to build these projects. And I did a story last year. Little Caesars Arena was the first one to use that standard, where they signed this agreement that if 51% of Detroit residents aren't building this thing, the various contractors will get fined.
Mm.
And and it turns out, I mean, the percentage was like 15% or something like that of Detroit residents
The
were,
actual percentage of was
yeah,
about 15%
yeah,
locals hired.
yeah, of the city of Detroit residents. Yeah, and once again, that goes back to two different arguments on that. The construction industry will just say, we were devastated by the recession, and we just lost so many people who moved because there wasn't enough work. And so it's impossible for us to now gear up to this amount of work
Hmm.
to get Detroit residents. And others will say, the construction industry was never kind to people of color.
Hmm.
And they point to things like, all the training that you need to do is out in the suburbs, and if you want a job like this, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you don't have a car, it's really difficult to literally for you to go out and get the training to get, the apprentice programs for you to get in these programs to get these kind of jobs. So, unfortunately, Little Caesars Arena won't be the only development that's going on that will fail to meet 51% of Detroit residents working on construction to build their projects. I don't think any project will meet that requirement anytime soon.
Well, it gets to the heart of what we were talking about in our earlier conversation. What can Detroit do differently that other cities? What can Detroit learn from the mistakes of other cities? And what I often hear is people say there was no wealth transferred to the community. There was no trickle down in Portland's gentrification cycle. It didn't. All this investment did not benefit the local residents because there were no deliberative wealth creation programs, which is really the only way you can actually get money into the hands of the locals when you have most people are renters, and it's a game that's property owner to property owner is the only that's the only people who benefit are the property owners. Another one is the other thing was land. To build affordable housing, the most expensive part of building affordable housing is the land, and it seems like Detroit has land in it's got plenty of land, and it also has this opportunity to think about it. Well, it's already thinking about how do we do local wealth generation, but the land issue is a huge one, and that kind of leads us into the Detroit Land Bank. What is that? That's one of our four sort of feudal lords that control the bubble. Who is the land bank or what is the land bank and who controls the land bank?
Well, the Detroit Land Bank is a city agency that wasn't very powerful before the foreclosure crisis, but they basically control property that's been foreclosed on. And so now, by far, they are the largest landowner in the city of Detroit. They hold on to properties that, whether it's houses, empty lots, buildings that have been lost through the foreclosure process, and they've taken it away from the owner, either, mainly because of the property tax foreclosure. And they're more powerful outside of the bubble than inside the bubble. I mean, outside of the 7.2 square miles, but they still own property throughout Detroit. But they own, I'm going to say, more than double than anybody else in the city of Detroit. They are simply the people who hold on to it, and then there's another agency, mainly I'm going to say a mix of Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, the development part of the city, the planning and development part, who are trying to come up with big plans to, like, how do we market, say, 10 blocks of this city to one big plan? Let's make it marketable to, depending on what the property is, if it's just a residence, I mean, if it's a neighborhood, let's try to do one big bang of 4 blocks and get various developers involved and build, bike paths and open space, and that's ways to revive different parts of the city.
And I think that's kind of like always the danger of, you get into these SimCity planners, they get excited about making mega deals, when there is an opportunity to do it. But has there ever been, or is there a conversation about dispersing the land amongst, the people, the common people, just giving the land like a small plot to people and letting them do whatever they want with it?
Yeah, I'm starting to notice that conversation now, as the city starts to unroll its plans for various neighborhoods of, like, here's what we're going to do with it. I've talked to at least 3 different neighborhoods, their neighborhood associations, um, and they are definitely frustrated that there are pieces of land that they think they should have control of, that somebody should buy, or they don't like the mystery part so far of what would they're just waiting for the city to roll out what the plan is, and I mean how much housing is going to be there, and so there is frustration from like individual people like I want to own that empty lot
Mm-hmm.
to like we should have more control over those two empty blocks that you now control. It was interesting. I don't know how long ago, about 4 years ago, the city started like this Marshall like program to tear down 5,000 empty houses a year, and that was part of why the Detroit Land Bank started to seize all these properties so they could uh, have just basic count of how many empty properties there were,
Mm-hmm.
and then figure out how many are just beyond the point of being structurally unsound and they should go. They simply should just be demolished. And so we've been on this program to tear down, I think, 5,000 houses a year. I don't think we ever met that number, but they are going at a pretty rapid rate.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was initial glee of people like, okay, they finally tore down these abandoned houses. And so there's still lots of support for that program, but now people are starting to question, okay, so what are you going to do with the property now? We should have a say in it. And I don't think that process is at the point yet where it's dominating conversations, but I've noticed people are starting to have concerns of like, well, hey, wait a minute now. We should have more of a say of what you're going to do with this property, and shouldn't. So it's an unanswered question. I think those conversations are just starting to happen of how much control they will have, how much say they will have, and that'll be interesting. I think that's part of the stories I want to follow next year and starting now, because it's just starting to happen, really.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see an experiment there where, as the land becomes valuable, if it's in the public possession, for it to be just given back to individuals, whether they, could make a credible argument that they used to live in the neighborhood and were, displaced or shut out through, one decade of discrimination or another.
That is,
or they're just responsible and can hold the land and do something with it. But I mean, that's an opportunity to create wealth, restore local control, and really, that's what made America. It was like a lot of small landowners. It's the individual farmer, who built the democracy. As unfair and racist as it was to take the land from the Indians and give it to white people for free, but it was a system that turned European tenants into landowners. It'd be interesting to see it happen kind of in a different form.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me, and I can think of 3 or 4 neighborhoods where I've talked to people where lots of land have been cleared. So now they live on streets where there's only 2 or 3 houses left, and they've fallen in love with the empty space. and they're like, hey man, why do we have to need why do we need anything? I mean, this is peaceful now. It is. I mean, and a lot of these residents, they lived in Detroit 90s and 80s, and you can imagine the crime and the crack and all the things they put up with, the lack of city services. You can't blame them if why build something new when this is fine? This is peace. This is good.
Yeah.
And it is. It's often very pleasant, and they're often the ones who take care of it. They go out and mow the lawns and shovel the snow, so yeah, lots of parts of Detroit look like that now. Just kind of big empty spaces between houses, and you can always tell if somebody's who's taking care of it, because you can see people mowing the lawn and just chilling, on that empty space. So you're right. I mean, that would be an interesting.
Well, and sort of the last big player downtown, if we were just close up the theme, would be Midtown Inc.
Oh yes, a very different animal than private billionaires. It is a private public entity that it's a nonprofit, uh, and it is was support. It's supported by foundations, uh, banks, the city intelligentsia of like you be the big urban planners. So they are both developer, buyer, uh, lender at times to a big swath of the city, and they are the ones who control basically development in a big swath of this bubble. Uh, you know, uh, they can kill deals, they can make deals, and they have little oversight. And most people, I mean, there's been lots of support of them, and they have done tremendous amount of development. They have created and are responsible for lots of development, of bringing in new stores and things like that. But now, of course, there is a backlash because they tend to favor things like Shinola, uh, Jack White. There's some older businesses that are feeling left behind. There are developers
What
who
does
have
that mean,
been.
Shinola and Jack White, for us who
Oh,
are
I'm
not
sorry.
in Detroit?
Shinola is the fancy watch company
Oh,
uh, um, that they bought a warehouse that was Midtown helped broker this deal, and they make like really expensive watches and bikes,
oh,
and it's a huge deal. And right next in that same building, Midtown Inc. helped bring Jack White of the White Stripes
oh.
to have a record shop and a record making production plant. So very high end, high profile stuff.
Hmm.
Um,
Do they build
they
much affordable housing?
they do, yeah. They built some stuff in Cass Corridor. They've I can think of two at least two different apartment complexes that were dead, and it's all affordable housing. They yeah do the 20% affordable housing deal requirement as everyone else. They're behind a push to change the zoning in Midtown Inc. And so there'll be a lot less drive-throughs. Basically, I mean, they really want kind of like that true urban density where there's like no space between buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Buildings could only be a certain height. The first floor should be retail. There should be some residential. They basically want a much more walkability, that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
now they bought a huge other on Woodward Avenue on the northern edge of the bubble that's still going through change where there's more empty buildings than uh, occupied buildings. They bought, I think, basically a block of empty storefronts and are finding tenants for it. Um, Nonprofits, the kind of retail that they want, restaurants, things like that.
So they are really kind of creating. They're a nonprofit, a charitable nonprofit, but they're really very focused on creating high end development and and making
Yeah,
things shishi downtown, as we used to say.
they would deny that, but yes.
Well,
uh, they would deny that. I mean, they would just say, look, it was underdeveloped. Someone needed a plan to like steer this ship correctly, and they are the ones who do it.
so what do you think is the future of the bubble here and Greater Detroit?
Well, we just continue to go on separate tracks. Uh, I think there'll be more spillover, which is good. There'll be more other investments. I think it'll help bring other parts of Detroit back, especially the ones closest to the bubble. Um, but I think the real test will be a recession
Hmm.
in terms of when business is down and retail is down, um, and all these developments to see if they can survive. But more of the same. Ford Motor Company just announced that they're going to buy the old train station, which is in the bubble, uh, and they're going to, have it be the base of their, um, electric and self-driving division, and it's going to transform that neighborhood called Coretown, which has already been going through lots of upscale change. Um, so I think, like any other spaces, it becomes more secure. It seems like it's I don't know. It almost seems it's a separate city. Almost it's
Hmm.
than the rest of the city. It's just becomes more expensive. Um, becomes more white. It becomes more educated. It's very pleasant to be around most times.
Well,
Uh,
sadly, that's what we
so
see all over the country is a tale of two
yeah.
cities, where it does not trickle down. It's a
Oh,
walled off community with just you can't see the walls anymore.
can I ask you? I mean, where do you think? How do you think this conversation changes, or this trend changes? What is the other specific solutions? You talked about it's always landowners, and so shouldn't the conversation start there of somehow you give people who've been in a neighborhood for, I don't know, a certain number of years more power, like a stake in some way, like an equity stake or something? It seems to me,
I think that's what it is. I think that you need more diversity of land ownership or property ownership. There's too much accumulation at the top, and around the country we're moving towards feudalism and away from even capitalism. I mean, it's getting uh, regressing so far. Like I was saying, if you have 4 landlords and 99 tenants, that's not capitalism, that's feudalism. That's the system that this country was founded to rebel against. We founded this country in order to shut that system down, and we're moving back to it, and it's very clear in places like Detroit. So I think you need to give the land back to the people. Call it whatever ism you want. I'm just being rational. If whatever works, and it seems like more property in the hands of more people is the way things need to go. Well, that is, I think, where we're going to have to wrap it up. And
well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
sir, thank you very much, and hopefully we can have you back because there's so much more to talk about in Detroit and the region. Thanks so much.
Thank you.